Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's episode of A New Thing. It's wonderful to be with all of you today, and we're going to be talking about that thing that happened 2 weeks ago, the attempted assassination of President Trump by that man. And like I've talked about the assassinations before, especially the first one in Pennsylvania when that happened oh man, 2 years ago, right? Time flies. I think is when that happened, right? That summer. And and I've already given like my thoughts on that, right? That I don't really find the assassination as a compelling Christian thing to do. And yeah, not good, right? Not good. But what I wanted to talk about today uh, was turning the other cheek and the assassination attempt and the way that that phrase is used, turning the other cheek and things like that. And I'll explain why when we get into it. So first of all, just let's look at our verse. Obviously, it's going to be Sermon on the Mount. Um, we got it right here, verse 38 through 42, right? You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Really, really difficult passage teaching from Jesus here, right? On loving our neighbors and the idea that we should not retaliate. And one of the first places that many of us go is to try and find a situation where this is acceptable, right? Where it's acceptable to retaliate. Um, People often say, this is about honor, and so when someone is dishonoring you, you don't attack them back. I mean, I would agree with that. But you can see here, right? This is also stuff that the Roman state, would do. For instance, force someone to go 2 miles or 1 mile with them to carry their things. That was something Roman soldiers were able to do, to force civilians to carry their stuff for them. So that's like the state imposing itself on someone. And Jesus says, not only do it once, but do it 2 miles, right? Go the extra mile for them. I think this is really hard for us to grapple with, and especially as Americans, because Americans, we love our liberties. We're jealous for our liberties, in the old way of saying it. Um, and that's not a bad thing. Okay, I'm not disparaging that, but like I think that there are certain teachings of God that rub up against every culture, and I think that this is one of them. And especially like it's not a bad thing to go to the most extreme circumstances and go, well, what it like? Yes, okay, yeah, someone attacks you, you know, sure, yeah, no, don't defend yourself, but what about other people, right? Um, and things like that, and that's where there's the rub and the difficulty of the ethics, right? And what we're going to do today is I'll show you why I'm talking about this. And then we're going to look at other examples of people making arguments to justify kind of the use of force in certain situations. And then we're going to look at the church fathers and what they have to say about it. And then I'm going to give you my own opinion, which isn't going to be that radical. So don't stick around for me, but mostly stick around just for the conversation that we're going to have around these texts, because we might not think about this that often, but this is an important thing, especially when it's impacting our public life. So I'm going to look at first the manifesto that was written by the shooter who was going to attack Trump. Now, first, when this came out, I was kind of skeptical of it, right? Because it's like, how do you know how accurate this is when it's first released, right? I mean, there's all sorts of fake stuff flying around these days, so I didn't know if it was accurate or not. With the research I was doing last night, I was attempting to like find, whether or not it was. So I was using my Gemini. I was using, web browser searches, all that type of stuff, right? And so from that, it seems as though this is being treated as a legitimate source because the police have quoted it, the FBI has used it in their investigation, so it seems to be relevant. Even if it's not, I think what's interesting about it is that it uses arguments that we probably heard before and have seen, except it uses it from a Christian lens. It's kind of interesting. So it's from the shooter, right? And it's on the New York Post because really they're the only ones that posted it in full. I wasn't really able to find it somewhere else, right? I don't even remember who the guy's name is, and honestly, here it is. It's Cole Allen, something like that. Um, that's not as important, but he has these objections. So he lays out what's he going to do, who his targets are, all that type of stuff. And then he gets to objections, and I was so struck by the first objection by this, right? So it says, as a Christian, you should turn the other cheek. That's the objection, right? So you shouldn't try to assassinate the president. You should turn the other cheek, right? And this is his rebuttal to that. It's kind of interesting. He formats it like Thomas Aquinas. He says, turning the other cheek is for when you yourself are oppressed. I'm not the person raped in a detention camp. I'm not the fisherman executed without trial. I'm not a school kid blown up or a child starved or a teenager girl abused by the many criminals in this administration. Turning the other cheek is when someone else is oppressed, is not Christian behavior. It is complicity in the oppressor's crimes, right? Using uh, language here that reminds me a lot of like Marxist language. I'm not saying that that's, talk about oppressed and oppressor. That's just immediately where it goes. But that's besides the point, right? Like, this is an argument, and I think one that we should take seriously, right? Like, yeah, you can say someone else you should turn the other cheek, but like if you see someone else being hurt, should you turn the other cheek? I think most of us would say no, right? Like, you shouldn't just stand there and let someone else be hurt, right? And so he's justifying his use of force to try and kill the president here by saying, this is for the greater good because of what he and his administration are allegedly doing, right? What he believes they're doing. So you see that. And then there's another one. He has another one right here about convenience. But then there's another one down here. Objection 5, yield unto Caesar. What is Caesar's? Rebuttal. The United States of America are ruled by law, not by any one or several people. Insofar as representatives and judges do not follow the law, no one is required to yield them anything so unlawfully ordered. I would also like to extend my appreciation to a great many people, since I will not be able to talk with them again unless the Secret Service is astoundingly incompetent. I guess they were astoundingly incompetent because he's still alive, right? Although I actually don't think that's incompetence. I think that's competence that they were able to keep him alive. So yeah, right here again, right, it's this idea that the state has forfeited its ability because it's been unjust to be respected, and therefore I'm able to take this violent action. Now, of course, like for us as the United, if you're a Trump hater, right, you would be like, oh, okay, this is. I'm not saying everyone is like this, but I do know that there are some people who are like, oh, this isn't, a big deal or whatever else. Like, why should we be surprised that someone's trying to kill our president? He's the worst, whatever, right? But I would say for most people in the United States, like, this is not good, right? We don't see this as a positive thing that anyone is trying to use violence to justify their behavior, especially someone like this who's going to just go off the rails and do it. I think if anything, as Christians, we should pray for this guy and pray that he changes and realizes what God calls him to do, and that what this attempt was evil, right? To try and murder a bunch of people. But let's not use like a crazy guy. I mean, he does. I don't think he's crazy. I think he's thinking clearly, but not well. Let's not use a crazy situation. Let's go to like a situation that a lot more of us would have a tough time dealing with. And so I want to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this is a essay that he wrote, so I'll explain that in a little bit. But in case you don't know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian during World War II and leading up to it. Very important. He's a Lutheran. Wrote lots of great stuff. Yeah, really important. And but one of the things he does is, as the 1930s go on, he's seeing the Nazi Party take power in Germany and do lots of other evil things. He joins a movement that's a minority movement in Germany in the church called the Confessing Church, which says we're not going to take party with the Nazis. We're not going to join the church and the state, which the mainstream German church had done. And so they form this group, and he's part of this group, and eventually, right, he attempts to assassinate, part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. And that is one of those moments where many of us would go, "Oh, Hitler, though, that's like an example of a fine assassination attempt or whatever else," right? So what I want to do is I want to read this, and now this was written much before his attempted assassination. This was written in 1933. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes this essay called "The Church and the Jewish Question." The Jewish question was the term that the Nazis used to talk about the Jews in Germany. So this is not him at all agreeing with them, and you're going to see that here. But just to say this, but he has this idea. He compares the state to a car, and the person in charge of the state as the driver, and the church is in the passenger seat, and the state is about to run all of these people over. You're going to see him make a reference to a wheel, so I just want you to understand what that means. So he says there are three possibilities for action that the church can take vis-a-vis the state. You can see that kind of at the bottom of this paragraph. First, as we have said, questioning the state as to the legitimate state character of its actions. That is, making the state responsible for what it does, right? So this in the United States, we would say like the legal recourse system. So if the state does something bad, you sue and you try and make it better, right? Second is service to the victims of the state's actions. The church has an unconditional obligation towards victims of any societal order, even if they do not belong to the Christian community. Let us work for the good of all. He quotes Galatians there. These are both ways in which the church in its freedom conducts itself in the interest of a free state. In times when the laws are changing, the church may under no circumstances neglect either of these duties, right? So the church has to call out the state when it does stuff bad, and the church has to help victims regardless who they are. I think many of us would agree with that. And this is where he goes into the more radical one, right? The third possibility is not just to bind up the wounds of the victims beneath the wheel, but to seize the wheel itself, right? So if this driver is going to run over people, you reach over and you grab the wheel, right, to keep them from doing that. So this is the direct action. He says such an action would be direct political action on the part of the church. This is only possible and called for if the church sees the state to be failing in its function of creating law and order. That is, if the church perceives that the state, without any scruples, has created either too much or too little law and order, it must see in either eventuality a threat to the existence of the state and thus to its own existence as well. There would be too little, if any, one group of citizens deprived of its rights. There would be too much in the case of an attack coming from the state on the nature of the church and its proclamation, such as the obligatory exclusion of baptized Jews from our Christian congregations, which is what was happening. Like if you were a Jewish person and you converted, you were to be shunned out of the church, right? Or a ban on missions to the Jews, also something that was stopped, right? You can't go and give the gospel to the Jews, right? In such a case, the church would find itself in a statu confessionis, a confession state, like a time to confess the truth, right? And the state would find itself in the act of self-negation. A state that incorporates a church that it has violated has lost its most loyal servant. But even this third kind of action by a church, which in a given case leads it into conflict with the existing state, is only the paradoxical expression of its ultimate recognition of the state. For the church itself is aware that it is here called upon to protect the state from itself and to preserve it. Basically, it takes this direct action as a way to love the state and to keep it alive, right? Because if you're going to let it be taken over and destroyed, you have to stop that from happening. For the church today, the Jewish question poses the first two possibilities as challenges of the hour, which it has a duty to meet. The necessity for immediate political action by the church must, however, be decided by an evangelical council as and when the occasion arises, and hence cannot be casuistically construed beforehand. So I know there's a lot of big words in there. Some of us might not know all these things, but let me just break it down, right? Basically, that the church in the third, when it deems it, has the goal of trying to take direct action to change the state. Doesn't exactly spell what that is, but you can see here it's pretty forceful in the sense of grabbing the wheel. But one of the interesting things is he says, well, this has to be like it can't just be one person, right? It has to be like a movement of the church. And of course, he's going to say kind of the confessing church, not the people who have gone along with the state, right? And I think like, you know, if we look at the Reformation, we can see like Protestant Christians who will, you know, like they'll convert to Protestantism and they'll take over the city council and then put it in, you know, and then, you know, spread the Reformation that way, right? That would kind of be like a direct action thing. The difficulty here, right, is is of course like eventually Bonhoeffer is going to try and join in on an assassination attempt on Hitler. Um, Not necessarily, I would say, with this evangelical council in mind. Eventually, it got so bad, and clearly it was terrible in Nazi Germany, right? That he decided that that was the step that needed to be taken. One of the things that would separate him from maybe some other people is that it's like, no, if we're going to do this, it's just a deep thought and wisdom of people, right? I still struggle with this personally, right? I think like it's easy to say this, but then it's one of these things where it's like, man, it's not easy to just because once you open the gates, you open the gates. That's my problem with any sort of political violence, right? But we'll get into that into later. But that's his argument, right? Better constructed argues, that this is out of love for the neighbors, for the people who are oppressed, and things like that, right? Rather than just going in to kill someone. And I'm not saying like that guy clearly cared about what he saw was an issue in the United States, but it's a little bit more well thought out of an argument about, okay, well, this is why assassination attempt might be a just thing to do. So now we're going to look at a brief video. This is from Pints with Aquinas. Matt Fradd is a Catholic content creator on YouTube, and he's interviewing Dr. Thomas Madden. Thomas Madden is a historian of the Crusades, and actually, I would say very good Crusade historian. One of the things, though, you always have to remember about history is just because someone is an expert in one area doesn't mean they're an expert in every area. I'm going to show that example, but I don't want this to be a condemnation of Thomas Madden. His book, The Concise History of the Crusades, is probably the best tiny single volume text if you're interested in learning about the Crusades and their history. So there's a lot of problems with things he says in this interview that I disagree with, but I just want to talk about this one because it's pertinent to this, right? So you can already see like the title for this episode is Thank God for the Crusades. I think that's a little bit of clickbait, and I think we should be more nuanced than that. I think to say the Crusades are entirely good and to thank God for them is a little intense. A little maybe and of course, like both Matt Fradd and Thomas Madden are Catholic, and so they do have, I think, a bias to show the Crusades in a positive light because it's a big part of the Latin Church's history. The ones that the Protestant division of the Latin Church like rejected in the Reformation, right? They rejected Crusades. The Catholic Church, while it has apologized and done things in more recent years, generally has a greater attachment to that history, right? Especially because you have like saints that were crusaders and stuff like that, right? So it's difficult to try and parse that out. So all that's aside, right? They're going to talk about this idea of turning the other cheek and what that means, because like moving it out of the just political assassination realm, like what do we do when it comes to war and all these other things, right? So let's take a listen to this.
Oh, okay. Let me ask, let's just dial this back a bit. I can imagine someone saying, how on earth can you reconcile with a straight face having a military order and turn the other cheek if someone slaps you, and he who fights with the sword dies by the sword? Blessed are the meek. How is this not an obvious perversion of Christianity that you're reinterpreting or something to make it seem like it's consistent with it?
Yeah, well, first of all, Christianity has never been a pacifist religion. I mean, violence is, in the Middle Ages and throughout Christian belief, was always, I mean, Christ also said, I have not come to bring peace but a sword. So it depends on what the violence is being used for. St. Augustine had long ago addressed these questions. Is it licit for a Christian to be a military man? Yes, it is. Is it licit to wage war? Yes, if it's a just war. If you are protecting those who would otherwise be harmed. And that's what's going on in the military orders. The military orders...
All right, so just to explain what those are, the military orders are groups of knights who have kind of taken on monastic qualities. So these are like the Knights Templar are the most famous of this, but also the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights of Santiago, the Knights of Lazarus, things like that, right? So I'm not. We're done with this video, but I just wanted to play that clip because of what he says. So what does he say? He says that the Crusades, that Christianity was never a pacifist religion, and that Jesus said, "I'd come not to bring peace but a sword," and that Augustine cleared this up for all of us. Now, this is where we're going to go in and we're going to read some primary sources. So this is or quotations from primary sources. So this is a book called Living Wisely with the Church Fathers. There's actually a whole series of these, and they do it on different issues. This is the one of them, and I actually use this for. I'm using it parts of this as research study for my doctoral project. But as I was, which is on art, so it's unrelated to this. But as I was reading this book, they do have a section on the military and what early Christians thought about the military. And so I can't be complete in this analysis, but I want to pull out some quotes. So I'm gonna give you a summation. We're gonna look at it again, but generally, the early church, especially in the first few centuries, was very anti-violence. So this is why I pointed out. Just because Thomas Madden is a very good historian of the Crusades does not mean he is particularly well read in everything, especially when it comes to the classical period, right? He does quote Augustine, and we'll get to Augustine, but generally in the early church, everyone is against murder, and a lot of people are really against military service because military service involves killing and it involves worshiping other gods and things like that, right? Now, I would say that, I guess if you want to put my eggs in the basket, I would actually agree. I would say that pacifism is not necessarily what the Bible commands Christians to do, right? But I would say that, like, to say that it's never been a pacifistic religion is to kind of not to admit that there's a multiplicity of views, right? Like, just because I guess that's the mainstream view that the church has adopted over the centuries does not mean that there has not been great thinkers and church fathers who disagreed with that and said, actually, no, we are turning the other cheek means no violence at all. So I'm just going to read one example. So this is Lactantius. He's writing in the first decade of the 4th century, so just a few decades before Augustine. He says, when God forbids killing, he is not only ordering us to avoid armed robbery, which is contrary even to public law, but he is forbidding what men regard as ethical. Thus, it is not right for a just man to serve in the army, since justice itself is his form of service. Nor is it right for a just man to charge someone with a capital crime. It doesn't matter whether you kill a man with a sword or with a word, since it is killing itself that is prohibited. And so there must be no exception to this command of God. Killing a human being whom God willed to be inviolable is always wrong. Right? And that is Lactantius's one take, but I'll just say that this is the general theme of the early church, the very early church, is that there is not, especially in the military, there is not a good reason for Christians to kill people. Right? There is, of course, but one of the things that's noticed is that there are Christians in the military. So a lot of these guys are responding to Christians being in the military. To me, that shows that, there's this maybe ideal among the theologians, but on the ground, it's different. Common thing that happens, right? Now, all of that changes after Constantine, because when Constantine comes in power, then Christians are the ones in power. They're the ones who have a duty to look after everyone. They're no longer just a sect that are doing their own thing. They are now in charge of looking after everyone, Christians and non-Christians, and that means, from a state perspective, with force and things like that, right? And that's where Augustine is helpful, because this is the shift, right? So it is true, generally, that before Constantine, Christians, negative view of killing, negative view of military, right? Using violence to do things, right? Negative view. After that, begins to suss out, okay, now that we are required to, how do we do that? And Augustine is really the guy who comes in. So we're going to look quickly at just a quote from Augustine. So, so this is the author, right? So he's filling this in, but he's also giving us a little bit of what Augustine says there. So he says, Augustine believes with sadness that occasionally the wise man will be forced to wage just wars. Still, quote, if he remembers that he is a human being, he will rather lament the fact that he is faced with the necessity of waging just wars. Why the necessity of such wars? The reality of injustice. For it is the injustice of the opposing side that lays on the wise man the duty of waging wars, and this injustice is assuredly to be deplored by a human being. And so everyone who reflects with sorrow on such grievous evils in all their horror and cruelty must acknowledge the misery of them. Indeed, Augustine argues, a man who experiences such evils, or even thinks about them without heartfelt grief, is assuredly in a far more pitiable condition if he thinks himself happy simply because he has lost all human feeling. So, what, like, this is, I believe it's from the City of God. Let me just check real quick. It sounds like it's from the City of God. Yes, it is. So, one of his big works. So here, right, he's saying that even in the case of the state, right, or the Christian ruler, that sometimes we have to wage wars to love and preserve our neighbors, right? And sometimes that means killing other people. He says this is a bad thing. We don't desire to do that. We do this only with justice in mind and things like that, right? That's the push from Augustine, and that's like the nuance that's there when we talk about violence, right? Is like when we think about violence or anything, is this a just action? Is this a thing that is actually good, and whatever else, right? So, all right, let's keep going. I just want to get to the summation because the author is going to sum up what this means. So, he says he's summing up everything that's here, right? With the conversion of Constantine, perspectives changed. It is not long before we discover church fathers such as Augustine advocating the legitimacy of Christian service in the military and the use of force by the state and the church in resisting evil. Thus, the consensus we see in the church's great creedal traditions is lacking in the church fathers' perspective on warfare, military service, and resistance to evil, especially since the conversion of Constantine and Augustine's lifetime in writing. When the Roman world became a largely Christian world, views on legitimate use of force shifted. The temptation to exercise power dramatically increased, including the use of the sword to achieve Christian ends. Right? And earlier, he says, as we've seen, ancient Christians such as Athenagoras, Tertullian, Origen, Martin of Tours, and Paulinus were firmly opposed to any use of violence in responding to evil and to Christian service in the military. And I think that's something we need to wrestle with, right? Like, it's like, okay, especially in the United States where we really honor, and I'm not saying wrongly, but we honor military service here, right? That's one of those issues where it's like, man, it's a different world than the early church, and we need to wrestle with the idea of taking life and justice and whether or not that can be done by the state, and is it possible, right? And Augustine says yes, it can, and he's living in a time where it's a necessity that maybe that happens, right? Just lots to wrestle with. All right, so let me bring it back for us and kind of let me sum it up, right? So sometimes, right, we can see violence as being a necessity, and I think the wisdom of the church is that violence is wrong. Right? Violence is bad, or it's not ideal at the very least, right? But sometimes is a necessary thing. I think to say that violence at all times is wrong and sinful, I think goes a step too far, because we also hold to the Old Testament, and God can use war to mete out justice. Generally, the early church would say, well, that was a special dispensation for that time. I don't really buy that argument. I don't see that as being abandoned. I think that can still be used today. But, like, we have to understand that is a last resort, right? That's the importance of the just war, the idea, right? Is attacking someone, trying to kill them, trying to bomb them, trying to do whatever else, right? Is that actually your last resort, or are you jumping too quickly to that conclusion, right? And this would be my critique of the man who tried to get to Trump, right? Regardless of what you think of him, even though I would disagree with such kind of a broad statement as he made, right? That is not this is not the proper response to that. It is not in a wheel grabbing moment. And I would actually say the same thing to Bonhoeffer, right? And I know that I really respect Bonhoeffer. Who knows how I would act in a situation like that? Would I even be brave enough to take a stand against the Nazis, regardless of of whether or not I would do any other thing else, right? I don't know. I'd like to think I'd be brave enough, but you never know, right? So I respect him greatly for that. But I don't think we should be resorting to violence immediately. Like I don't think it's on the conscience of individual Christians to take it upon themselves to say, I'm going to solve the problems of the world, because that is a Pandora's box that I think would be very unwise to open for what it would release, right? And I'm not against Augustine entirely, right? I'll take the wisdom of the early church and agree, say, listen, yeah, violence is bad, killing is bad. Sometimes I believe it might be a necessity to love my neighbors, but generally should be avoided at all costs, right? And we shouldn't try and do that. Um, and I think Augustine sets us up well for kind of like thinking, especially from a state perspective, a grand's perspective, like, and even an individual one, like, have we exhausted everything before we go around killing people? And are we trying to end war as soon as possible and lamenting the fact that we're at war? Oftentimes those things do not happen, right? So all this is to say is, turning the other cheek is not something to be thrown aside and to be explained away so easily. Even if it's attacking someone else, even if it's part of an unjust system, absolutely you stick up for people, but you don't go from turning your cheek to trying to kill the other person, right? That's not the one to one. We need to be wise in our understanding and loving in our responses to evil, not only to the person who's doing the evil, but also to the people who are being attacked, right? And we need to be wise in our decision and really care about whether or not we're honoring God in what we're doing. So that's all I want to talk about today. Hope you guys found that interesting. I'll see you on Sunday for worship, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Peace out.